Hey, everybody. Welcome to The Vote, a conversation about the 2024 U.S. elections with Lynne Tracy, the U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation, and Charlie Cook, renowned political analyst. My name's Lisa Dickey, and I am a co-author and collaborating writer on about 25 books, including 12 New York Times bestsellers. But the book I'm probably most proud of is a book I did about Russia and travels across Russia over a 20-year period. It's called Bears in the Streets. So I want to introduce our two panelists today. First of all, Ambassador Lynne Tracy. She was sworn in as the ambassador to the Russian Federation on January the 9th of 2023. She is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service. Most recently, she served as ambassador to the Republic of Armenia. Prior to that, she served as senior advisor for Russia Affairs in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, which is quite a mouthful. And she was also deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow from 2014 to 2017. So long and deep experience in Russia. Ambassador Tracy, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Lisa.
I would also like to welcome Charlie Cook, who is widely regarded as a leading authority on U.S. elections and political trends. In 1984, Mr. Cook founded the Cook Political Report. He was just 30 years old. He started the Cook Political Report, which is an independent, nonpartisan newsletter that the New York Times has described as, quote, authoritative for both parties. And legendary CBS Evening News anchor Bob Schieffer has called it the Bible of the political community. So we are in good hands with our two panelists. We're going to learn a lot about U.S. elections today. And to kick it off, I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Tracy, and ask you to give us just a brief overview. What is going to happen on November 5th? What is happening now? And if you have any personal reflections about as a voter in elections past, take it away.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for that very kind introduction. I have no crystal balls, so I'll make no promises or predictions, but it is wonderful to work together again with you, and what an honor to share the stage with Charlie Cook, an authority of the highest caliber on U.S. elections and political trends. Allow me to welcome everyone virtually to historic Spaso House. I am thrilled that we are once again opening the ambassador's residence to our Live from Spaso series. And I could think of no better venue than this to have a conversation about the upcoming U.S. elections. I am a career diplomat and a public servant, and that means that I won't be speaking in partisan terms about any candidate, but I am a partisan when it comes to democracy as a system of governance. I am looking forward to a discussion about the role that elections play in the United States to guarantee a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. These powerful words from President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in 1863 continue to inspire and illuminate the essence and strength of U.S. democracy. And I am personally dedicated to the idea that every citizen deserves to have their voice heard and deserves to have a hand in carving out their own future. There is no other vehicle that can provide that freedom better than a full-fledged, healthy, living and breathing democracy. And I still remember the first time I voted. It was the 1984 presidential election. Our small town hall was packed with people patiently waiting their turn to vote, to express their will on the choice of leaders and the direction of our country and our local community. I felt a sense of pride and privilege that has never dimmed when exercising this right and responsibility over the course of many elections, even when my preferred candidate or initiative did not prevail. One more point about elections before turning the floor back to you, Lisa, and that is elections alone, the act of voting, are not enough to guarantee a government that respects the will of the people. The context of elections also matters. Are they taking place freely and fairly? Is there a level playing field for candidates and issues to gain access to being on the ballot? Are candidates able to openly and thoroughly debate difficult or consequential choices ahead and offer opposing points of view to those in power without fear of retribution? Are there mechanisms of accountability and an environment of media freedom to keep those in power honest? Some of these questions we continue to wrestle with and can produce passionate discussions, but these open debates are the fuel of freedom. They reinforce the underlying and enduring resilience in the American practice of democracy. And so I look forward to exploring all these issues and more with our Russian audience tonight. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Ambassador Tracy. Mr. Cook, would you like to talk to us for a little bit? I think one of the questions a lot of people have who are not U.S. voters is, what is the deal with the Electoral College? How does that work? Why do we have it? And then if you want to share a personal story, that would be great.
Sure. First, it's an honor to be on with all of you. And I want to thank Ambassador Tracy for her and her colleagues, the great public service that they do for our country, represent our country so well. I guess I'm showing my age. My first election or first vote was in 1972. And our political process, our political parties, everything has changed remarkably over this span. It's kind of a moving target. We're always trying to, as it evolves, trying to understand what is going on, why is it happening, and where might it go next. You don't have to be from Russia. You don't have to be from somewhere else to be somewhat confused about our political process, because but it's important to remember that the United States came together as 13 separate entities, states effectively, and there were some bigger states, more populous, some were smaller states, and compromises were made. The smaller states did not want to be controlled by the big states, but the big states say, we've got more people, so we should have a bigger say. So all of this was a matter of compromises that occurred to kind of, in order to create this country. And is it more complicated than it could be? Yes. Would someone design this from scratch now? Probably not. But when I have people, as I travel around the country, who ask me, why don't you just have one big national vote? And I understand that. And frankly, I don't like the idea of one candidate having more votes than the person who wins. But if we were to get rid of the Electoral College, if we were just to go to a straight national election, what would happen is very clear, is that the candidates would go around between 5 or 6 or 8 major cities and would devote all their attention and maybe design their appeal to go towards people that live in these big cities, when and the rest of the country would be sort of on the outside looking in. And that while it is true that this election effectively comes down to 7 states, but there's 7 very different states that the states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, up in the northern part, in what we call Frost Belt. They were the 3 states that effectively determined the election back in 2016 between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. They tend to be industrial states. Then you have states like Nevada out west in Phoenix, or high growth of the Southwest flavor. And then you have Georgia, North Carolina. So, it's not that each one individually is a microcosm of the country, but taken together, it's a rough facsimile of the country as a whole. It's not, as I said, it's not a perfect system, but the alternative is, I think, would be a whole lot worse. And that's what our governance is about. It's about people reaching compromises between the interests of people that are very, very, very different, and coming up with something in between. And where we fall short is when people are not willing to compromise, when people are not willing to give in some in order to get some of what they want. When people refuse to compromise, that's where it gets bad, and where the system starts to break down. My first job in politics was working on a man from my hometown was running for the U.S. Senate, and I helped out doing research work and driving him around some. And my freshman year of college, I came to Washington and I started working on Capitol Hill. In fact, I like to tell people that Joe Biden and I went on the U.S. Senate payroll the same month, January of 1973. And, he was a freshman senator, had just turned 30 years old, and I was a freshman in college when we first met. You watch from the span of the Nixon administration all the way to today, we've seen it all. And, sometimes the system works better than others, but I think our job is just to kind of make the best of it. And I don't take sides. I just try to act like an umpire in a baseball game and just call them as I see them. And so I don't root for either side, just basically say what I see. And of course, whatever I say it should not be reflective on the Department of State or Ambassador Tracy. And but I'll try not to upset the apple cart too much.
I want to just make a quick commentary on the Electoral College, and then I do have a question for you, Mr. Cook, about it, one that I actually don't know the answer to, but I think I do. But anyway, just as a commentary on the Electoral College, I'm actually a resident of the state of California, but because California goes reliably for one candidate over the other, it's generally Democratic. I have traveled to another state to go and canvass and knock on doors. So I am actually currently in North Carolina doing that. And that is some of the sort of strange things that happen is, as you say, this relentless focus on 7 out of 50 states. And so I do think it's a really curious process. And I'm wondering if there are any other countries who have something similar, or whether most countries who have democratic elections have just a general popular vote.
I'm not aware of any country that does it like we do. I guess maybe I should have stepped back and just sort of on a very elementary basis. Each of the 50 states gets 2 electors, one representing each of the 2 U.S. Senate seats they have, and then 1 other elector for each of the congressional districts that they have. And then the District of Columbia, which is technically not a state, they get 3 electors as well. But Lisa, your home state has, as I remember, it's 52 congressional districts and 2 U.S. Senate, so you have 54 electors, and the smallest states only have 3. Does it give small states proportionally more influence than they otherwise would? Yeah, it would. But there's some other factors as well. I mean, for example, the Democratic vote nationwide tends to be very concentrated in about 7 states, California being the top one, California, New York, Massachusetts on. And to the extent that Republicans have a natural advantage in our system, in the Electoral College, part of it is it's not tilted their way. It's just that once you win a state by 1 vote, you get the state's electors. Actually, there are 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, that do it very slightly differently. But so in other words, when Joe Biden wins California, wins 11 million votes to 6 million for Trump back in 2020, 5 million vote, the 5 million vote difference, it counts in the national polls and it counts in the national popular vote. But once Biden had 1 more vote than Trump, the rest of that 5 million didn't really impact the outcome of the election. And because Democrats have their vote is so concentrated as 7, if they really wanted to win elections, they should encourage their people to move out around the country and spread out and maximize their potential.
Yeah. Well, I think the sort of key point you make about the Electoral College is that no system is perfect. And we have this system, and it's not going to change anytime soon. I think that's quite clear. And so, so it's everybody has to work within what it is that we have. I want to move on to a question for Ambassador Tracy. We have 2 strong political parties in the United States, Democrats and Republicans. We do have other political parties, but they are much, much, much smaller and much weaker. Why do you think that is? And what do you think the prospects are of that ever changing?
Well, there's a history of the development of political parties in the United States. And I think in modern times, it is the Democratic Party and the Republican Party that have dominated, but that hasn't always been the case. I mean, I think you can go back and look to around the period of the Civil War, and there was clearly a shift that brought the Republican Party into being, and it gained strength. And it was, what powered the development and growth of the Republican Party was, a time of upheaval in our country. I don't want to make predictions now about whether some of the debate, the very passionate feelings that people are expressing is going to suddenly open the doors wide for the emergence of a really strong third political party. But I think over the years, what we have seen is that there is almost always a third party that's consistently appearing on the ballot in most states. And there is some, I think I've heard in my own conversations with family and friends, coverage of electoral periods where sometimes voters feel frustrated and limited, that they only have, sometimes there's a feeling they only have two choices. And that is what starts to drive people toward looking at alternatives. But I think so far, they're just my own sense. And, I would certainly, Charlie's with us and he may also have some perspective on this. But I don't know that we've had enough of a demand for a third party in such numbers that people are willing to leave either of the two major parties. But I think what it says is there are choices. And sometimes when you have very close elections, as we have been experiencing, that this issue of third parties can have an impact on the outcomes.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? The way it's fascinating how with our two major political parties and how sort of wildly diverged they are on a lot of viewpoints, how incredibly evenly divided this country has been in the last few presidential elections. It seems really surprising to me that it really feels like 50-50 as we go forward. I find that to be really kind of a surprising thing.
If I could jump in just to add to what Ambassador Tracy had to say, on one level, there's nothing that would keep a third or fourth party or independent candidate from emerging. But with this weird electoral college system we have, it creates a dynamic that makes it pretty close to impossible now for a third party to win. I mean, to be practically speaking, and it wasn't designed to do that, but that's the effect. But one of the things that's changed so much, and our parties do evolve, as Ambassador Tracy said. For example, to the extent back when there were issues, forces that kept down, made it much more difficult for African Americans to vote. In the 19th century and early 20th century, but to the extent that African Americans voted, they oftentimes were Republican. Why? Well, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, who freed the slaves, and that the Democratic Party tended to be, back in those days, the party of Southerners and very conservative, and people that back in those days were somewhat against civil rights. And that didn't really start changing a little bit under Franklin Roosevelt, but much more under President Johnson with the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts that were pushed by Democrats, although I should say that the Voting Rights Act would never have passed had the Republican leader in the Senate, Everett Dirksen, not gotten on board. But the thing is, the thing that once made our system so stable was that we had two broad-based, geographically, ideologically diverse parties, and each one had moderating influences on the other, and there was a substantial overlap. And I remember political scientists used to complain that our political parties were not ideologically coherent. You know, they didn't think there should be conservative Democrats or liberal Republicans. And, you know, this is messy. But the thing is, that's what actually gave our system so much stability. And it wasn't until the 80s, a little bit, but more the 90s, that you started seeing conservatives leaving the Democratic Party and liberals leaving the Republican Party, and centrists in each party voting in primaries a little less, that you saw these parties move apart. And to the extent that we're having troubles today, I think it's because our parties they've kind of lost their moderating influences, and the people that were the glue that did the compromises and reached formed the consensus, that those people have been sort of outnumbered both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and the parties have just moved so far apart.
Well, and I'm curious, I want to sort of branch out from that observation when you talk about sort of moderating influences being less on each of the sides. One of the things I think that's really fascinating about what's going on in US politics right now is that we have a lot of people who are questioning the very legitimacy of our elections. Who actually won in 2020? Who will actually win in 2024? Is the vote going to be fair? Is the vote going to be protected? Is there anything comparable that you know of in US history of elections where one side is sort of routinely questioning and the other one is saying these are free and fair elections? Can you just speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, you would have to go back to the period just before, during, just after the Civil War, a period they called Reconstruction, to find anything really much like this. And some of it is about the changes in our politics, but a lot of it's sort of the change in people and society. And there are some people that, whether we're talking about politics or whether we're talking about a sporting event or something, as far as they're concerned, there could only be two outcomes: either I win or it's been stolen from me. And part of growing up and being on athletic teams as a kid is you're supposed to kind of learn how to play as hard as you can, try your best to win. But if the other side wins, then you accept it and go home and try to beat them next time. It's about, human behavior. And some people have kind of lost that. And that we've developed something that some are calling it negative partisanship. And it's a feeling among some people, and this is true Republican and Democrat, that in some ways they almost seem to hate the other party more than they like their own. And which I know it sounds nutty, but some people are like that, and they're unified by who they aren't or who they don't like more than what they are for. But our system was never designed to be tidy, and sometimes it is frustrating to watch it, but it kind of is what it is. We just have to kind of go with it. But it's
the 2024 election motto. We just kind of have to go with it. Ambassador Tracy, let me build on that and ask you a question about the election. And, obviously there's early voting that can happen in a number of states. People can drop off ballots in drop boxes. They can mail in ballots. It's a more popular thing to do now than it was a few years ago. I think it's legal in more states than it was. We had the experience of a lot of long lines on election day for people for a few elections. And I think people are welcoming the ability to vote early. So election day is obviously this Tuesday, November 5th. What happens in terms of counting the votes? When will we know who the winner is? And I think it's pretty clear that it's going to be close, and there's probably going to be some question in some people's minds about how legitimate and fair the vote was. Can you speak to what we might expect on November 5th and in the days to follow?
So, Lisa, I think one point that's very important to share with our audience is that the U.S. administration of elections is a decentralized system. So it's run by the states. The rules that are set that govern the questions of how mail-in ballots are handled, when ballots have to be received by, the days of voting that are available, for instance, for early voting. All of these things and other administrative matters are decided at the state level. And there are variations. I mean, just one quick example is related to absentee mail-in ballots. I've seen the state of Ohio, for instance, where I am a registered voter, as long as the mail-in ballot is postmarked by election day, it can be received up to 4 days later and it will be counted. I looked and I saw another state, same rule, but allowed for 7 days. And some people might ask, well, why is this extra time allowed past election day itself? One reason is because we have many voters who are abroad. I am among them. We have members in the military service who are abroad, and so some of these accommodations are meant to assist with people who are outside the United States to ensure that their ballot is counted. Some of it is just because of taking into account that we do sometimes have slowdowns in mail delivery, but it's really intended to make sure to give voters a real chance to have their votes counted. But to your question about why does it take so long sometimes, or what might we expect to see, I think particularly because this election is the polls are showing that it's going to be incredibly close. That means that the votes that we're seeing counted, we may have to see many more of them counted to have a sense of where the totals are coming out. Because in some states, for instance, and I have a family member who's in Pennsylvania, and one of the rules that I know that Pennsylvania has with mail-in ballots, for instance, is that absentee and mail-in ballots cannot be opened and counted until election day. And so if you have a huge volume coming in and you're not able to start even looking at them and counting them until election day, that can take time. That's part of what was at work in 2020, because we had so many people voting by mail because of COVID and the pandemic, that it just took time. And there was the elections were close. I mean, people may recall, for instance, Georgia was decided by 10,000 votes out of, I think, the state population is roughly, 16 million. So there's the closer the election, and with these rules that we have that govern how votes are to be counted, it can all add up to a slowdown. I think, when it comes to when we might see a result, I think the thing I would tell audience members is I would be surprised if we have an outcome on election evening in the United States, which historically we have been able to get those projections on election night. But when it's so close like this, that seems less likely based on some of our past experience.
Yeah, and I recall in 2020 we didn't have the official announcement of Joe Biden having won for, I think it was a week later. Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you, Mr. Cook.
Just to add to what Ambassador Tracy said, that it is the when do you count, when do you open ballots? It is a patchwork of different rules in different states. But also, I think a lot of times in media coverage, things get kind of oversimplified. And all of these things that may sound like it's Democrats over here, Republicans over here, it's actually, deep down a little bit more complicated than that. And for example, after the 2020 election, where obviously a lot of former then President Trump's supporters didn't think it had done fairly. But what a lot of people don't realize is that, the election was the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November. He was in office till January 20th. And, you had 56 FBI offices field offices around the country. You had 10,000 FBI agents. You had all these, and they were all looking around, and none of them found any evidence of any systemic corrupting of votes or anything, or anything that would change the outcome. And that you had a group that was led by a guy named Ben Ginsberg, who had been the sort of quarterback for George W. Bush's legal operation in the Bush v. Gore back from the 2000 election. Here's a Republican, he used to be counsel of the Republican National Committee, and led a group of Republican, conservative, legal scholars, others, to basically say, look, here are all the allegations, and there's nothing to them. There just really isn't. And they did this report on, www.lostnotstolen.com. And so some of these things can be painted in a partisan way, but really they're factions within each party. And it's not exactly accurate to say, everybody in one party believes this and everybody in the other party believes that.
But that is an interesting detail, though, right? Like, just to remind people, in the George W. Bush versus Al Gore in 2000 rather famously went on for several weeks after Election Day because it was that close. It was very, very difficult to ascertain who won. Ultimately, it was argued in the courts. Ultimately, the Supreme Court weighed in. And I think people are wondering if something similar will happen now. So it is interesting to have had a Republican who fought or sort of, worked in that battle in 2000 say in 2020, there was not anything significant, systemic. And so obviously the hope is that in 2024, the same will be true. Nobody wants the vote to be compromised. Nobody wants the vote to be, in any way unfair. And so, we have to hope that the same happens, and that if it does happen, that it's recognized as such.
When people ask me, when are we going to know who won?
Yeah. When are we going to know? I'd like to know. Tell us.
Without being a smart aleck, define no. What is your level of certainty?
Yeah.
Is it 95%? Is it 90? Is it 80? Is it 60? A lot of times, and I've worked for 30 odd years at various networks on election night on the decision desk. And you see patterns emerge, you see evidence that looks like it's going, and you think you know where it's going to go. But the threshold for calling a race and saying, okay, there is no path for the loser to win this, that's a pretty high level of certainty. And that does take a lot of time. But sometimes if the difference between the two sides is wide enough, you'll see races that are called the moment the polls close because they had expectations. They did exit polls through the day. The exit polls findings were matching up with all the other available evidence, and it looked like it easy, but sometimes they wait for days.
Sure. Well, at what point, it seems to me that one of the factors that comes into play is whether or not the person who appears to have lost the vote actually concedes. And it seems to me that at that point, that's when it's done. But I don't know whether that's going to come into play in this particular election. It seems like it could.
We have had elections where someone conceded prematurely and the results ended up going the other way, not presidential, but that has happened. But I think someone said, well, what if one of these candidates doesn't concede and says this was stolen? The key thing to me is it's not what one candidate says. It's do the protestations that I didn't lose, that this side didn't lose, are they credible, or do they just look like somebody kind
sour
of
grapes? Right.
Yeah. And so the distance between the two, and while yes, this election does look like it's just razor thin, but at the end, even in a race like this one, where only 2, 3, 4 percentage points of voters are undecided, at some point, most of them do decide. And they typically don't split down the middle. They typically break one way or break
Right.
the other. And so, for example, of the 7 swing states in this election, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, of these 7, back in 2016, Donald Trump won 6 out of 7, all except for Nevada. And then in 2020, Joe Biden won 6 out of 7, all except for North Carolina. And 2008 and 2012 tend to be like that, where the close ones broke one way. But then if you look at 2000, 2004, the closest states in those 2 elections, they did kind of split relatively evenly.
Right. And to the question of, the fairness of the election and making sure that there's not any kind of shenanigans going on. And this is a question from a viewer, and so I throw it open to either one of you who would like to take it. Are there neutral observers at polling stations, and how are the election commissions formed? So in other words, do we have a system in which there are people making sure at the polls on the day of the elections that people are able to freely vote?
Generally speaking, there's someone there that's job is to be neutral. Now, in this increasingly partisan environment, that's sometimes can be easier said than done. But generally speaking, there is. And for the vast majority of these elections, there's just no dispute whatsoever. But it so it's only fairly recently that this started coming up, but part of it is just sort of a product of the acrimony that we have between the 2 parties, where there are hardcore partisans in each side that just hate the other side and believe that there's nothing the other side wouldn't stoop to in order to get or hold on to power. And that's obviously not the way our system was built in terms of compromising, and but it's something that does make for more complicated situations. But generally speaking, yes, there are neutral people, but every state does it slightly differently, and within states, some localities do it somewhat differently.
Right.
And Lisa, I think it's important to just for our Russian audience to maybe understand that the vast majority of elections that are administered at a very local level, the administrators are nonpartisan. It's not about one party or another controlling the oversight, the machinery of the conducting of elections. Managing as people come in and get their ticket or whatever they need to go to the ballot box. I think the other point I just want to jump in and make is that, when there are disputes, this is back to, what if somebody doesn't concede? But there are plenty of mechanisms in our system by which a candidate that is aggrieved, that wants to contest, has the means to contest. Some of that happens in the local electoral administration setting where votes are being reviewed and counted, and there's a chance for people to speak up. There's also opportunities to take disputes to the courts, and I think we saw that in 2020. That's exactly what happened, and those cases were heard, in a number of jurisdictions, and were thoroughly heard. So there are avenues, but there does come a point, because of meeting deadlines and because of the need for resolution, but having still had the opportunity to have been heard. But the system does work its way toward a result. And then I would just say, the 2000 election is something I certainly remember. There was a lot of controversy around it. People felt very strongly. But I think the point here also is, not everyone got the outcome they wanted or the outcome they favored, but our system continued. We found a way to continue working together as a democracy. And we also looked at what some people thought were the shortcomings. Not all of them have necessarily been addressed, but people continued to move forward.
And one other thing is when we have had recounts where they've gone back and just started from scratch and recounted either every single vote or every vote in a certain pool where there was some question, it is remarkable how close the original count was. That it is extraordinarily rare to see the direction changed after a recount. And for something that's not where I don't think we spend as much money on administering elections as we should, but it's remarkable that they've been proved to be as accurate as they have, given they would, it'd be better if they had more resources.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Well, I think probably if you ask any people, like a number of people would say, the result of this particular election matters less than moving forward with some sort of faith and trust in the fact that our elections are free and fair. Because, one election is one election, but if you begin to sort of crumble the framework upon which our free and fair elections were built, that's going to be problematic for a really long time to come. So, so that'll be very, very interesting to see how that all unfolds in the days leading up to November 5th and on November 5th, but probably even more important in the days following November 5th, because I think you are right, Mr. Cook. This is not going to be decided that evening. I think we're all going to be sort of glued to our televisions for the, the days following November 5th to see what happens. So that's kind of where we are. And I'm curious, actually, Ambassador Tracy, I'd like to ask, a lot of other democratic countries have much, much shorter campaigns than we do. We've been going through this for 2 long years, very long, very expensive. I think it's fair to say that a lot of people, particularly in swing states, are just ready for the thing to be over. Why are our campaign seasons so long?
Well, there's, first of all, we're a very big country, and it hasn't always been the case that you've had more of a handful of states or, just these battleground states that Charlie's identified being the states that everyone's looking at as deciding the outcome. And so I think, candidates had to be out active and working in a number of states and districts. I mean, I remember when Iowa, everybody had to spend lots and lots of time in Iowa because they went first, and it was a very intensive system of picking a winner in the Iowa caucuses, and it set a certain momentum, but you had to invest the time, and investing time also meant money, and getting the money together to run a presidential campaign in a big country like the United States, I think has also been something that has lengthened our campaign season, because people start declaring and raising money much, much earlier in order to meet these hurdles. And I think the impact of television and the ads, social media. I mean, all these factors that again have required a lot of fundraising, I think has had an impact on the length of the campaign. But I totally agree. I mean, when I talk to family and friends, I think there is a feeling sometimes of, couldn't we find a way to make this shorter? But I think, as I said, I think we're just, there is some reflection of the size of our country and the need to reach out so broadly.
Also, though, there's a schedule, and we can look, it's every 4 years, period. Parliamentary systems, usually it has to be by X, but they can call elections sooner. So, but we know exactly the dates of presidential elections, what they're going to be in the 2030s and 40s and 50s and 60s and on. So if you know exactly when the election is going to be, and it's not going to be any sooner, then the people start preparing around that. But in a parliamentary system, You know, a lot of times there's some question about whether, you know, the government, are they going to, you know, call an election this year? Are they going to call a snap election? Are they going to have one this year? It's going to be next year. So just simply having a set calendar the way we do, that isn't common. That leads to, you know, that's one reason why we have sort of the odd schedule we have, is we have a different system.
That's a great point. Yeah, ours are all decided well in advance, and the others, the snap elections, yeah, which is nothing like we've ever had. So, I'm going to ask one more question of you, Mr. Cook, and then I'm going to ask a few questions from the audience. So, audience members, if you have any questions you would like to ask either the ambassador or Mr. Cook, please go ahead and send them in. But I want to ask you, Mr. Cook, about how media and social media has been transforming elections over the last 10, 20 years. And how I want to talk a little bit about disinformation and some of the things that happen when false information gets out there and gets spread around. And it just feels like this is a major issue in elections, not just in our country, but around the world. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Until the mid to late 1980s, our news coverage was typically broad-based, and there was no real alignment between, you know, which certain television networks and the Democratic side or the Republican side or liberal or conservative or anything like that. And in the late 80s, early 90s, and you first saw it with radio. And we had something called the Fairness Doctrine until the late 80s, but where, you know, if you had to give equal time to the other side, and as long as a broadcaster has to give equal time, then it's going to be, you know, more or less kind of equal. But when that was eliminated in the late 80s, you started seeing a rise of conservative talk radio. And then soon after that, you had cable television news really become bigger, and you had programming decisions. It's like, well, you know, conservatives feel like their voices aren't heard. So what if we created a conservative network that would appeal to this group? And then someone else says, hey, they're doing that. Well, let's do it liberal. And then you started seeing this kind of pull away in the 90s and early 2000s. And then when you had, you know, the internet and ideological websites coming online, and then eventually social media, that's when things started getting incredibly fractured. And the product of that was that there was a natural tendency with some people to, a trusted source is someone who I'm going to agree with, and who I think they look at things the way I do. And when you had fewer people consuming news that wasn't designed for one side or the other, and that's when, in my opinion, the wheels started coming off the bus, and where suddenly broadcasters whose mission had been, or journalists whose missions had been to be as objective as they possibly can, started, giving people what they want, and we started seeing this fracturing taking place, and in some cases starting to look more like propaganda than like an objective communication of news.
Ambassador, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Just that we certainly, I think, take very, very seriously the concerns about the impact of disinformation, and we have had concerns about disinformation that are coming from foreign sources. Secretary Blinken has spoken out about this. I think we have identified just in this election some very serious cases that resulted in some sanctions against Russia Today because what we were seeing was not a media organization operating in a way that media organizations typically operate, but attempting to influence without disclosure actors in the United States and to try to push the election, the narratives in the election in ways that seem to be aimed at sowing division, sowing false stories. And so, we work very hard to try to expose that, to ensure that what voters are able to do is to see the information openly and transparently, and to understand the sources behind the information that they're getting in order to make the best informed decisions that they can on election day.
Yep. Speaking of open and transparent information, we just got a question in from someone saying, for Ambassador Tracy, if the U.S. is a free country, why can't you talk about which candidate you prefer?
I'm sorry, there was a garble there in the microphone, Lisa.
Oh, sorry. Why can't you talk about which candidate you prefer in this election?
Well, so I am, as I said, I'm a career diplomat. I'm a public servant. And when I joined the State Department, the Foreign Service in 1994, the oath that I took was not to an individual. It was not to a particular party. It was to the Constitution of the United States. And as a career government employee, we are expected to work for the will of the American people. And so we have to be ready to support choices that American voters make, that sometimes those choices are of one party and sometimes they're of another party. And in order to try to carry that mission out, to work credibly for any choice that the American people make, we have a number of laws that govern, or I should say laws and regulations that govern our behavior to try to ensure that we, government employees, maintain a posture of nonpartisanship, to try to maintain the trust and confidence of those who come into office after an election.
So to clarify, you can vote, but it is not something for you to sort of go out and say publicly or campaign or anything like that, that is not something that is acceptable.
That's correct. We are allowed to vote. We're even allowed to make campaign donations. Mm-hmm. But what we cannot do is to advocate publicly for any candidate or party.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, just to add to that, I'm sort of from the old school, and then how I came up in journalism is you follow the same policy, and so for myself, my wife, we don't put signs or stickers on, we don't make campaign contributions. How can someone look at you and listen to you and think you're being objective if it's clear who you're for? Now, I will say I'm old school, and there are certainly plenty of people in journalism that are maybe not as vigilant as I am. And I think when things are kids, they're grown and gone, but they're free now to do whatever they wanted. But
right.
As long as they were living in my house, they were not going to have to put a sign up out in the front yard, because how can people look at me and say, journalist, I've got a Republican or a Democrat sign out front. Or
I've had friends in journalism who for years did not even vote. They took it that far. They just did not believe that they could do any kind of partisan anything. But obviously not everybody. That's about the hardest line you can take on that.
That always struck me as extreme, because we do have secret ballots, and to me, to not vote is the implication is it doesn't matter. I don't care.
Right.
Well, hell, of course I care, but
Right.
it's nobody's business how I,
Yeah.
what I
Yeah.
do in the sanctity of a voting booth.
Right.
But
That makes sense to me. Yeah, I know. I think it's legitimate to vote, but yeah, it's an interesting question, and people very much try to maintain a posture of being neutral, being independent, being seen that way, and I think that it makes a lot of sense.
But
We are. Yeah, go ahead.
we don't stop being citizens, and we have responsibilities as citizens.
Right.
And I'll just say, I've never made a campaign contribution, but I do vote, and I've decided, across my career, in terms of my own identification, to be an independent. But I think you can do all these things to try to help manage. But you can't always do, if you go to too far of an extreme. I don't think that it necessarily, at the end of the day, helps you navigate what happens over the course of a career, which is that you do wind up serving office holders who may have very different views about how to execute their responsibilities, and you have to learn to, as I said, respect the will of the voters.
Yep.
Ambassador, how many presidents have you served under? Do the math quick.
I think 6.
Okay, yeah, and some have been Democrats, some have been Republicans, and you were seen as a pro, and fair-minded, and that's the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah. I did a book about the White House Situation Room with George Stephanopoulos. It came out this summer, and one of the things that people said repeatedly about serving in the Situation Room was, we serve the presidency, not the individual president. And I think that makes a lot of sense. We're running out of time. I'm just gonna ask you 2 questions, quick ones. First for Mr. Cook, and then for Ambassador Tracy, and then Ambassador Tracy, I'll ask you to just make a little closing statement to wrap it up. But Mr. Cook, there's a question from a viewer. Do you think that the polarization of American society will lead to a decrease in the number of swing states over time? And will we see such patterns in upcoming electoral cycles?
Wow, that's a really good question. We have many fewer swing states now than we used to, but I think we have 7 right now, and pretty much everyone agrees on which they are. I don't know that it'll get much less than that. I think it's unfortunate that we don't have more, but it's, people, a lot of people, increasingly, they move to where they feel comfortable, and they move away from where they don't feel comfortable. And so you have sort of migration patterns that occur that tend to make, some Democratic states more Democrat, some Republican states more Republican. But I don't think it's going to change a lot more. But this is certainly a lot fewer than we used to.
Right.
But it's like the red areas are getting redder and the blue areas are getting bluer and the purple is shrinking. But I think it's probably shrunk about as much as it probably will.
Yep. Okay, great. And then this, the final question, also from a viewer, is for you, Ambassador. I'm just going to read it exactly as it came in. Dear Ms. Tracy, regardless of the results of the presidential elections, are you going to host a New Year's party this year? Last year, it was an unforgettable experience in the Spaso House. I have been to Spaso House, and I can tell you it is absolutely unforgettable. I would love to come to the New Year's party. Are you going to have one?
We will be having a holiday party again this year. We are very fortunate to have Spaso House as a platform and a place where Americans and Russians can meet, where we can have open discussion and also have fun, enjoy good music and good conversation. And so we're looking forward to doing that again at the end of this year.
One of my favorite memories from being in Moscow in 1988 was I got roped into being a server at a party at Spaso House. I was working at the U.S. Embassy, and I got to serve orange juice to Andrei Sakharov, and I was very excited by that. So big memory for me. This has been so interesting. I've learned things as well. I am so appreciative of all the information that you have provided for us today. And Ambassador Tracy, if you want to wrap it up for us, that would be great.
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to you, Lisa, and to Charlie for making this such a rich discussion and sharing with our Russian audience this knowledge and insight into a very historic moment, a very important moment in U.S. democracy. And what I just would like to say to our Russian audience is that this kind of open exchange, it's a part of what makes U.S. democracy strong. We talk about our strengths, we talk about our weaknesses, and that openness, that frankness is what I think gives us that resilience, that ability to resolve conflicts, to find a way through conflicts, and to keep our country growing and to have an opportunity to think about how we can do better in the future. And I hope that we can do that with Russian audiences as well. I think this is very important in any society, to be able to speak openly and freely and truth to power.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And everybody, stay tuned. Next week's going to be a very exciting and very important week, and we'll see what happens. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.